بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفعالنا وتقبل منا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافل للذنوب لا أنت الخالق وأنت الرازق. أرسلته عليه الصلاة والسلام بالهدى ودين الحق ليعلم الناس الطريق إليك وليقوم القسط بالوحي، فنصلي ونسلم عليه على الدوام. أما بعد, we wanted to get into this controversial issue. And this is another round, at addressing the problematic discourse that's coming from Zaytuna Institute with regard to the issue of racism and police brutality, with regard to the issue of white supremacy. One of the things that I want to say is this, that we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to guide us all and to accept from us all. And we thank our brothers for whatever good work that they have done. And we appreciate the efforts that are made. One of the things, I parked here intentionally around the corner from Humboldt Park in Chicago itself. And as you see in the background, it says looted empty. Okay. And one of the reasons why I parked here to do this live is so that we're in touch with the reality on the ground, at least minimally. This whole concept of looted empty, it doesn't come out of a fake reality. It comes out of a reality which we're seeing unfold itself. And that has a lot to do with police brutality. It has to do with systemic racism. It has to do with the breakdown in the society. It has to do with the wealth gap. It has to do with people's choices. It has to do with frustration. It has to do with a lot of the imbalances that we're seeing in the society, and they go unaddressed. Throughout the years, when we look back in the 90s, may Allah bless him, Shaikh Yusuf, he was talking a social analysis that was extremely leftist. We saw that he was analyzing the direction of society, employing Chomsky and others. And he talked about how bad the society was, and he got into the whole concept of the Dajjal and the New World Order. That was his approach. And then he began to go into other directions. He went with, for a short period of time, may Allah bless him, forgive us and forgive him, he started going into the perennialist philosophy. And before that, he was analyzing, psychoanalyzing, socially analyzing what was going on in the Middle East. And he was talking about the dictators in the Middle East. He did a whole series later on about symbolism and the satanic presence, in popular culture and so on and so forth. He went with the perennialists. And when he was questioned on that, he was saying that it was a dawah strategy. At least that's the information that came to me. He said that he wasn't a perennialist. There was an internal battle or an internal discussion that took place amongst traditionalists themselves with regard to that philosophical position. In recent times, Zaytuna has taken on the whole conservative twist. And so with every change in philosophy that comes with Zaytuna, The community is supposed to follow along. You know, there were things that were said with regard to the African American community that had ruffled feathers in the past with regard to the issue of racism. And it created a division in the community, right? We've had recently Dr. Abdullah Hamid Ali, may Allah bless him and accept from him his work. He's come out with a number of different statements trying to open up different trajectories of thinking with regard to race and so on and so forth. And as being part of Zaytuna and Lamppost, they've been pushing this whole idea. Yesterday, they were pushing the idea of white supremacy and shirk. And then today they tell us he was following Dr. Sherman Jackson. And then now he's saying that white supremacy is something else. The philosophy switched and changed. So with every change in philosophy, you know, of every attempt at exploring ideas, we're not obligated to run with you on that. You know what I'm saying? That's the issue that I have with Zaytuna. We're not obligated to run with you with every change of philosophical exploration that you get into, especially when it's not where the community is at. This is where the community is at. This is where society is at. We have a social problem. It's not a fake problem. It's a real problem. We have riots going on. Here in the Midwest, there was in Madison and Wisconsin, there was a young lady that was set afire. You know, we have real issues that are on the ground with where the society is at. I appreciate the attempts. I appreciate the attempts at nuances. I appreciate diversity of thinking, but this is not a philosophical experiment. We're not engaged in a philosophical experiment. We're engaged in trying to understand what are practical steps to addressing real life issues. There's no empowerment program that has come out of that camp with regard, especially the black community. There's no empowerment program other than to throw out some philosophical ideas, and that's it. When it comes to on the ground work, there's no on the ground work because the work is too difficult. If we were to ask what is the presence of Zaytuna in a city like Philadelphia, in which brothers are from that city, it'll be like nilch because there is no direct involvement. It's too difficult. Let's be honest. So, you know, there's a lot of situations that, you know, we have to address. And of those is this denial of racism, this denial that there's problems in the legal system, this denial of police brutality, this attempt to characterize everything as a leftist strategy, right? Just because you changed in philosophical orientation and you found the home in conservatism doesn't mean that we agree with you as Muslims or as a community. And so if you're going to take that position, you take the position, but there's no necessity of trying to undermine where other people are at. There's no necessity of trying to undermine where other people are at and how other people understand. If we want to address this issue solidly, let's have a conference and bring data in on the reality on the ground, on the conditions of educational institutions, on the wealth gap. You can't just blame the wealth gap on individuals. And notice I said you can't just blame the wealth gap or poverty on individuals. Let me ask you a question, not to make it personal. But when we start looking, for instance, at an institution, an educational institution, which is run by African Americans in the Muslim community, how many of those educational institutions run by African Americans in the Muslim community are well funded? How many of them get $1 million in their budget, or $500,000, or $250,000 on a fundraiser? How many of the masajid in the inner city just for the Muslim community by itself, in the African American Muslim community, and exclude Worth Deen out of it? How many of them are stable economically, and able to be to carry out their visions as they would like, as it was understood, social work, community work, as some of our imams did in the past. If that question is not addressed properly, in other words, if we don't address that there's a real economic problem within the African American community, and it has a lot to do with support coming from the Muslims, and it has a lot to do with where people are at socially. If we can't address those issues, and notice I left out certain groups, and we can have this discussion all day long. If we can't address these issues systematically and properly, bringing solutions, if we're just in the business of blaming people as individuals and saying that it's your fault because you didn't make it, then what kind of real solution are we bringing to the table? We are trying to say that their moral failings and their lack of motivation is the reason why people are in the situation that they're in. We expect more from Zaytuna Institute. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has said things about racism in the past that has gotten him in trouble with the community itself. He's not an authority on this issue. That's the reality at the end of the day. There's some things that you're just not an authority on. That you can't speak about every issue overall. That's a problem. So if people are not experiencing these realities, we can't negate that they exist. And I'm talking about the experience of racism. To say that, for instance, that the U.S. is one of the least societies that the laws are racist. Where do you come up with this type of stuff? The U.S. has Puerto Rico in hand as one of the oldest colonies, an indigenous community. The U.S. still has reservations in which Native Americans are suffering from suicide, health issues, and so on and so forth. The U.S. incarcerates more of its people than anyone else in the world. And the majority of those people incarcerated are African Americans. We can go on and deal with these issues. We could bring in data. We can bring in research. We can bring in books. There's reports that are done from body cams, reports that are done to show that there's disparities in the way that police deal with the African American community. And the Latinos are there as well. The general tendency in that regard is always that the Latinos are just a little less than the African Americans. So if we were to talk about the African Americans, it would be sufficient to cover the black and brown communities when it comes to discrimination and other issues. I'm not here to get into a philosophical debate because the data is there. The data could be brought. We can bring in the lawyers. We can bring in the people to deal with mortality rates. We can bring in the educationists to talk about the problems in education. We could talk about the problems in the economy. Just because you think that there's some sort of liberal agenda doesn't mean that we can't deal with principles and data and information and so on and so forth. We don't have to follow you into your newfound conservatism. That's just a reality at the end of the day. If we can't have an honest dialogue about issues, if we can't talk about issues as the way that they should be talked about, looking at the situation on the ground, looking at people's experiences, doing a systematic analysis of data, and then coming out with a solid position, then there's no conversation. We don't need to get into polemics. And that's what it seems ever since Zaytuna went to the Trump administration. There's this steady push that the community has to be on the conservative note. Yesterday you were leftist. It didn't work for you. So now you jumped on the conservative bandwagon. It's not our problem if your philosophy didn't work yesterday, and now later you want to switch it up. If you're going to switch it up, you should have an honest discourse as to why you think that there should be a shift in philosophy, but not try to negate people because they don't agree with you. That's the reality on the ground. There's a lot to be said on these points, but you're not connected to the community. For people that are living in Silicon Valley as their mental reality, you're not connected in the community. You're not connected to the reality on the ground. That's, we don't see you making an effort, like, for instance, with the Black Dawah Network. They have gone into the worst streets of Chicago, and I've accompanied them and the Flaming Crescent Society. They're in the middle they're going into the middle of the hood that has been hit with drugs, that's been hit with breakdown, trying to reach those people. And there's many other people working on that level, and they see the issues. Coming from social work, coming from working in the prison system, seeing these issues, seeing what's going on. So, the intellectual gaslighting is extremely problematic. To try to tell us that these problems are just invented by liberals. We're not talking about academic studies. We're talking about what we're seeing on the ground and how it plays itself out. Whether it has to do with healthcare, or whether it has to do with job opportunities, or whether it has to do with the educational system, whether it has to do with the roads, whether it has to do with lead, whether it has to do with the quality of the air in these environments. We can go on and on. But there's no, you guys are at the point where you try to empty out any discussion on social justice like it's some sort of leftist agenda. Go sit down and talk with the Catholic Church. They have a whole social justice program. And for the most part, there's been a critical assessment of Marxism and the left. They had letters that were written dealing with social justice issues overall. They just became a one-issue people, anti-abortion people, because they got caught in a two-party system. And they didn't have the ability to address their social justice platform. So that becomes, whatever internal debates that you have with other Muslims and other ideological positions and so on and so forth. The question still remains is that what are you doing to address social ills at a practical level? I would like to see a discussion had with a group like Iman in Chicago. Why don't we entertain a discussion with Iman in Chicago and talk about the types of things that they see in the community overall? What types of issues it is that they see? Are there disparities or not? And we can continue on. We can bring in Muslims and non-Muslims and have an honest dialogue about the condition of the society that we live in, right? And whether racism exists or doesn't exist, whether there's systematic racism or not. You're trying to tell me that studies that have come out that have shown that there's added interest to mortgage rates when it comes to the black and brown communities. You're trying to tell me that doesn't exist. You're trying to tell me redlining doesn't exist. You're trying to tell me an overwhelming police presence in the inner cities doesn't exist. You're trying to tell me that in the 80s that our cities getting flooded with drugs it wasn't a reality. You're trying to tell me that the fact that our schools, are dysfunctional because the government never addressed the issue of how to deal with the fact that you have economic disparities. The fact that there was an outsourcing of factories, there was an outsourcing of jobs, and it left many people in urban centers without employment. That means there was no tax base for them to be able to put back in their school system. You're telling me that that's their fault? That's a structural issue as to why some of these educational institutions are dysfunctional. There's a lot of things that I understand, the trajectory of thought. I understand the initiative. I understand the wanting to be critical of the Democratic Party. I understand the wanting to be critical of maybe people over relying on race arguments. I understand all of that. But to go to the opposite extreme and try to deny that these things take place, you don't have anything practical in place for us to even believe you. In every season that we turn around, there's a constant change in philosophy. And we're supposed to go with you like it's the new understanding and the right understanding of deen, like it abrogated what came before, and we have to follow you. We're not going to follow you along with this. As far as we're concerned, when we look, you're not doing anything for the community overall. You're not engaged in the community in a practical level to be able to address their issues. That's just the bottom line reality. So if we want to be honest, we should engage in a community dialogue. Let's see where the community is at. Let's see where the knowledge base is at. But you're not allowed to take the platform and act like you are the voice of authority on these issues. Especially because you don't have any studies with you other than a few conservative excerpts here and there. Whether it's on the issue of police brutality. Look at the statement that Hamza Yusuf just made with regard to police brutality, or it was just quoted. Almost as though that we, all whites are, whites get more aggression from the police than blacks. And the idea that there's no racism, that type of thing that's coming from both Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Abdullah Hamid Ali. It's extremely problematic, right? And I'm ending on the note of saying that, look, and again, you feel my tone. I'm just talking very freely, very openly. I'm not trying to create a systematic argument, because that all that philosophical stuff going back and forth, it doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. This is an invitation that if you want to take a position, let's have a solid community dialogue with people that don't agree with you in a non-combative, non-debative way, to come to a conclusion as to what is going to be the program of address. Rather than shooting from the sidelines, and using the internet just to weigh in on your opinion and writing an article here and there to try to influence the community ideologically, let's see what is the practical program of addressing these issues. What is the Islamic conclusion with regard to addressing these issues overall? And how is this going to directly impact, especially the black community, right? Whatever comes out of this. For me, there's nothing personal. There's no gain in this. Other than to say that, we can't allow you to just take the cause of justice and you throw it to the side like it doesn't exist. If you haven't experienced police brutality, do you know what it's like to have a gun taken out on you? Do you know what it's like to have 15 guns taken out on you, 12 guns taken out on you in front of your family? I'm not talking about theoretical situations. Do you know what it's like for you to be accused of a crime and you're taken into police custody without due process and then just thrown on the street as a teenager? Do you know what it's like to be followed around by the police for no reason? We can go on and on. Do you know what it's like to be made to get on the floor and take your shoes off with the gun to your head as a teenager? I'm telling you all the experiences that I've had on the East Coast. I'm telling you all the experience that I've had. The only experience that I would say outside of that was with the 12 to 15 guns, which was at the Canadian border. And then, by the way, as soon as I came in over the border, the New York police followed me because of my being Latino, because of my being Muslim. We can go on and on with different scenarios and situations. Do you know what it's like to watch a young boy whose mother was using crack and his mother is killed by the police just on the spot? That was something that was in our environment in North Philadelphia. So if you're not bringing tangible realities with personal life situations and data and so on and so forth, you're not a voice for the community, because you're not there standing out for the community. That's the bottom line. If if your whole agenda is to push conservatism because your goal is to counter the left and the LGBT community, because you see that to be a threat. But let me tell you something, that's not working as a strategy. Because what you're doing in the meantime and trying to implement that strategy is you're crapping on us. You're crapping on the brown and the black community, or the black and brown community, in the name of your political strategy. You're trying to intellectually gaslight us and tell us that what we perceive, we don't really perceive that we've been, injected with a liberal agenda. Like if people don't have their real life experiences. Like if people don't see what's going on. Do you know what it's like to go in as a mental health worker? You going into the school system and you see people's rights being violated. And because you have an authority, because you're a court mandated reporter, and you see how it is that their situation gets dealt with. Again, we can bring in stories and we can bring in data. We can have that discussion. But if you want to have a serious discussion about how you want to deal with the left, then don't do it by taking us out, by trying to say that our plight is not a real plight, that our situation is not a real situation. A lot of us, we listen, we watch, and we're tired of that type of approach. It's an irresponsible approach. Is an approach which is trying to dictate to the people what it is that they're experiencing, and you're trying to tell us that you have a deeper understanding of some sort of liberal agenda. No, you're the ones that went to the Trump administration. You're the ones that went to the Trump administration, and you're continuing with this conservative tone. Like I said, yesterday you were on something else. And every philosophical move you make, you want to push the community into that direction. But out of all of these situations that you find yourself in philosophically and working through, Zaytuna Institute, you have yet to talk about social justice when it comes to the black and the brown community. You've never spoken on these issues outright. That's just the reality at the end of the day. You've talked about systemic issues and so on and so forth when you were with Chomsky, but you never clearly addressed the plight. Matter of fact, I remember when Zaytuna Institute took the position that blacks should forgive whites. By implication, they don't have a right to reparations. By implications, they don't have a right to redress systemic issues or issues of injustice. That was the position that was taken by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, that blacks should forgive whites. And so that goes against where the black community is at. That goes against where the leadership was at. That goes against the struggle of Malcolm. That goes against a lot of the traditions outside of the Muslim community, within the Muslim community. And this is the continuous situation that we're finding ourselves in, that there's a lot of intellectual gaslighting and people are being told what to think, right? And that becomes the issue overall that, is the problem at the end of the day. We're being told what to think, although what we are experiencing is something else. It's a reality. This doesn't happen because things are not taking place. This goes way beyond George Floyd. This goes way beyond George Floyd. This is not just a manipulation of Soros. This is not just an agenda of Black Lives Matters as an LGBT group. Right? This goes way beyond. This has to do with an accumulation of frustrations that people have because of where things are going. So if you want to have a real discussion about what's in the best interest of the community, we advise you, before you lose all legitimacy in totality, to stop and entertain a discussion of what is the best approach to address the plight of the people. Forget about the ideology. Forget about the philosophical debates. What is a practical approach of addressing the problems of the society, in specific as it relates to the black and brown communities? Because that's, when we look at, for instance, Martin Luther King, he had an agenda to deal with poor people. We don't see that you have an agenda to deal with poor people other than blaming them. When we look at King, He marched because there was racism in the society. Right? When we look at Malcolm, he talked about police brutality. You're telling us it doesn't exist. When the leaders of the community at that time said it exists, and today the community still says it exists, and the data still proves that it exists. So we end on that note. If you want to come into a real dialogue, you want to have a real position, we want to see what is your practical stance on how you're going to begin to address the issues at the end of the day. We don't see that you went to the Trump administration to talk about justice for the people. Right? We don't see that we don't see any critiques on the Wall Street bankers right now as you have taken this conservative approach. We're not hearing anything about, protecting people that are unemployed and may be homeless. Right? We don't hear any address of the current economic situations and how they're playing themselves out. Right? So at the end of the day, right, we have to come up with some practical solutions of how we're going to deal with social issues besides just telling people to work on their spirituality. Joshua says, why not use the platform to focus on black and brown people that are serious about healing our community? That's true. The platform is there. There's dialogues going on, with people that are serious about working in the community. There's work that's being done as well. There's a lot that's lacking. There's a lot of changes that have to take place. There's a lot of sacrifices that need to be made to really be more effective. It's a lot of work. I'll be honest with you in that regard. Joshua, it's a lot of work and there's a lot of issues, but we've gotten involved and we are continuously, looking at ways to get involved. And I'm talking about there's a lot of people behind this. It's not just one group. You know what I'm saying? It's not just one individual. There's a lot of people that are discussing these ideas. And I mentioned, some of the people that have, looked at these issues overall. No, I don't. I honestly, the question is, why are you expending so much time trying to convince the so-called leaders of Islam who are hurting black and brown communities? I'm actually being, nice about the situation. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to convince anybody. That's why I say this is not a philosophical issue. That's why I'm not really coming with a lot of tightly constructed arguments and I got my points. I'm just talking freely about the issue because it's really about just letting people know that there's leadership that understands that narrative. There's a number of people that are watching that take place, and we're messaging to the people that we understand that's taking place, and we're not with them on that regard. We want to see, the empowerment of black and brown communities, and we have a commitment to teaching Islam in a way that empowers those communities because they need that, regardless of whether they become Muslim or not. That's another issue. That our contribution back to the society, whether they're Muslim or not, is that, the teachings of Islam have values that will help in empowering those communities, right? And that's part of the issue. We have to enter the discourse. We can't just be out of the discourse. Because there's a concerted effort to try to instill a certain type of discourse, within the community. And it's one which is basically telling people to focus on their individual spirituality, to focus on their individual lives, to be disconnected from social issues, to consider, any claims to justice as being leftist, liberal in agenda. There's a certain rhetoric that's being pushed out into the community, and what we have seen throughout the ages, is that when people become disconnected, when leadership becomes disconnected, when we talk about historical analysis from the people on the ground, then that's where, we begin to see real problems. If you look at Abul Hasan Nadwi, he compiled biographies of a number of different imams and mashaykh who were of different orientations. He talked about what it was that they contributed back to their communities and societies, and what it was that they contributed toward the revival of the deen. And one of the things that's consistent is that every time there was a disconnect between the leadership and the people on the ground, that means that Islam lost its space. Islam lost its ability, to really root itself in the people. And that's where we're at. We're not connected to the people's problems. And as long as that's the case, then Islam is not relevant to the people. And if Islam is not relevant to the people, people are not going to want to practice. It just becomes a ritual performance. So I personally don't feel that it's a lot of energy expended, but it's signaling to the people very clearly that we're watching. We see it. And that there's counter positions and there's alternative positions, especially for those who already have qualms with the Muslim community and saying, like, the Muslim community is not doing anything for us. I can't even find myself in the Muslim community, right? And so that's part of it. There is the other side, the other side of organizing and the other side of collaborating with those who are actually doing work on the ground. And I think to your point in that regard, it's solid. But to be honest with you, the ones who are outside of the Muslim community are doing more work than the Muslim community with regard to empowering black and brown communities. There's some Muslims in the black and brown community, in the leadership and in the community in general, that are doing good work, but the majority is outside of the Muslim community, right? And that's part of addressing this, that is necessary for us not to allow, our community to be marginalized and to be injected with certain ideas which disempower it and create a fissure or a gap between it and its responsibility. We have a responsibility to our community. As when we become Muslim, we have a mission to our community, back to our community. All of the prophets, alayhimus salam, they dealt with their people's conditions and situations. So that we have a responsibility from a da'wah side. And I'm not talking about necessarily converting people, but we have a responsibility for showing Islam, from that side, to be engaged in our community, right? And so, we leave it on that note. But, I think it's valid, just like you feel that way, that is a waste of energy. And I respect that. I feel that it's a waste of energy of how the leadership is going. Because it's an energy which is not focusing on taking care of the people. It's an energy that's focused on academics and ideology, and injecting in the people a certain type of political orientation that's not benefiting their existence, right? And so that's part of the problem that we confront. And there's been a number of us in different capacities that we have come together, and we agree that this is a problem. And part of this live is taking on the responsibility to represent some of the people that have come together to address this issue. So we end on that note. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.